This is Maureen Smith. I'm meeting with Kathy Rand.
Okay, I'm Kathy Rand. Pleased to be meeting with Maureen Smith. Looking forward to our interview together.
So, Kathy, let's begin with just some basic questions. Where were you born and when were you born?
Okay. I was born February 24th, 1945 in Miami Beach, Florida. My family is from Chicago, but was living in Florida most of the year, although I think they came back to Chicago in the summer and had a residence in Florida until I was about 2. And so we moved back to Chicago when I was 2, so I don't remember much about living in Florida as a child, as a baby.
And what part of Chicago did you live in?
I grew up in the South Shore neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, so we were 7900 South, and that's where I grew up the whole time after my family moved back here through high school.
And what about brothers, sisters, siblings?
I have a brother who's 12 years older than I am and a sister who's 10 years older than I am, so I was clearly not a intended child. I think my sister particularly was really excited to have a baby in the family, and I remember her telling me that the day I was born, my father got a convertible and her mother had a baby, and what could be better than both those things on the same day, a convertible and a baby. So she was excited, and so I think she really, I think my father loved kids and he was excited about having a baby. My mother was somebody who never was all that much into the whole maternal thing, into the housewife thing. It was just not her thing at all. I think had she been in a different generation, she would have been a career woman. And so not that she didn't like me, but she wasn't as excited about me, I think, as my sister and my father were. And my sister became very maternal toward me, and she would call my mother from school during the day to say, "How's the baby? Where's the baby? Is she okay?" So, I sort of grew up with her as a second mother.
Now, you mentioned when we talked on the phone that your father was pretty politically active.
My father was involved in Democratic politics, in the old days. One of my favorite stories that he tells is that they were in a polling place and things weren't going that well and for their candidate, and so they staged a car accident outside of the polling place, so everyone ran out to see what was wrong and they could stuff the ballot box when everyone was outside. So that was how Chicago politics worked in the old days. So.
Did he have an actual position in this, or was this all volunteer?
Yeah, it was just volunteer. He was just involved and knew a lot of the political figures on the South Side. So, so when I was 4, they thought I was a bright child, but I think they also, my mother particularly, was ready to not have a child in the house all the time, and so my father used his political connections to get a birth certificate saying that I was born a year later than I was. So I entered school when I was 4 with this birth certificate saying that I was 5 and that I had been born in Chicago. So it became sort of an interesting dilemma for me because my school records had 1944 as my birth date and Chicago as my city of birth, and that's what all my school records said, so that was what all my work records said, and that's what my Social Security said, and then when it was time to get a driver's license, I'm like, I'm not waiting, so that's what my driver's license said. So the two things that I didn't lie on were a passport and voter's card. Both of those had my legitimate birth date on them, but in the last not that many years, when between Homeland Security, Social Security, Medicare, I thought, you know what, I have to get this straightened out because someday I'm going to be getting on an airplane and someone's going to arrest me. So about probably 6-7 years ago, I went to the Social Security office and said, thinking they were going to think I'm nuts, I need to change my date of birth. And they said, oh yeah, we have a form for that. A lot of people wanted to be younger or older, so no problem, we have a form for that. So they gave me a form to fill out, and then once I changed that, I could change my driver's license, and everything sort of fell into place. So I shouldn't have waited 60 years, I suppose, but I did.
Oh, well. you got it done.
I got it done, yeah. I didn't get arrested trying to get on an airplane, so.
So in school, thinking back to your school days, does the fact that you were a little bit younger have any impact on your social life or other?
You know, at the time I never realized it, and it's really only recently that I realized why I was the shortest kid in the class, because I was 1 to 2 years younger than most of the other kids. I struggled with things like penmanship, and you remember in the old days where, you know, you had to have this perfect handwriting, and, you know, I didn't realize that I didn't really have the motor skills at 6 or whatever it was, you know, that you needed. So I think I had, you know, I wasn't conscious of the fact that I was at sort of a disadvantage, but I do think I had a lack of confidence. And I remember, you know, at some point in school, like, the teacher would ask a question, and I knew the answer, but I would think, well, it can't be right if everybody else didn't say it, you know, so it didn't sort of occur to me that I might know something that they didn't. So it was a process for me to sort of gain my confidence over the years. So I think it was a disadvantage for me more than I realized at the time, which is probably good that I didn't realize it at the time.
Oh, no, you can do it. Now, what about in high school? Did you have any glimmerings of your later activism or your leadership skills?
You know, activism, no, not at all, really. I mean, politically, my father still was involved with some of the local politicians, and he would sort of drag me along to help address envelopes or whatever, and so I did a little of that. The high school that I went to, instead of clubs, there were sororities and fraternities, and so I was active in my high school sorority, and I was the president of it, so, you know, that was probably sort of the beginning of leadership opportunities for me. So, yeah, I would say that. But not activism, really. It wasn't any, that came much later for me.
Mm-hmm. No. And then after high school, you went on to college.
I did. I went, actually, my first year in college, I stayed in Chicago and went to the University of Illinois, Chicago, which at the time was at Navy Pier. And that's Sam. And then my sister said to me, you know what, I did not go away to college. It's my biggest regret. I'm not going to let you make that same mistake. I plan to live my life through you. So she helped me, like, fill out applications and find a school and, you know, get admitted and do all that. So then, starting my sophomore year, I went to Michigan State.
Uh-huh. And your major?
I majored in English and with a minor in education. And, you know, this was in the, is he bothering you? Do I need to move him? Okay.
This is, we're talking about her cat.
Right. Sorry. Yeah. I had never really given any thought to working at all. It, you know, it was a time when girls were teachers or nurses, and honestly, I never thought I would work. I never thought about working. My father and my mother said, you know, you need to be a teacher because it's something good to go back to when the children are grown. But I honestly never thought about it, which seems so insane, but I really didn't. And so I graduated with a degree in English with a minor in education, and then I wasn't married and I didn't have any kids. So then I had to actually do it. And so I got a job teaching in the Chicago Public Schools. And I really hated every minute of it, you know, and I remembered back to an education class I had taken where they said teaching is not for everyone. I'm like, oh, that was me they were talking to, and I didn't realize that. You know, and I was young because, you know, I graduated college when I was 20. I was teaching some kids who were seniors in high school. They were 18 probably. They were bigger than me, and I had no ability to control their behavior at all. So, is that working okay? So, you know, they would run around and scream, and it was not a good experience for me. Toward the end of the year, I realized that if I took like a Valium and an antihistamine together, I could sort of like get through the day, and then I went home and ate a chocolate cake every day.
Oh, dear.
So it was not for me.
So how did you make your jump to your next job?
What I actually did was a college friend and I, she had just broken up with a fiance, and we were out together one day, and we're like, hey, why don't we move to California? So I, decided to just move to California, and I decided to go get a master's degree, and she was going to go just get a job or whatever. So we moved to San Francisco, and I went to graduate school at San Francisco State University in English, and then she ended up meeting the manager of the shoe department and getting married to him. And so at that point, my parents really wanted me to come back. And so they were like, okay, you don't have to be a teacher, just come back. So I came back to Chicago and, just sort of started looking for a job. And I ended up with a job in publishing, actually educational publishing, which sort of tied in with the school teacher thing. And most of the people in my department were all former teachers, and so it sort of combined the teaching and the English background. And so, I've since woven a career path based on the fact that I act like I really did, but it all just sort of fell together. It wasn't really planned. So I worked at this educational publishing company. Then I went from there to a trade publishing company and ended up as the managing editor of a publication called Appliance Manufacturer, which is a trade publication in the appliance industry. And then while I was there as an editor, I was the recipient of a lot of news releases and public relations materials, and I sort of got interested in public relations, so I sort of did a shift into public relations. So, and sort of at that same time while I was working at the publishing company was when I started to get activist in the women's movement. And so I was also used my experience working in now as a way to learn some skills that helped me in my career.
Okay. Let's continue on with your career path
just
a little bit, and then we're going to definitely come back to that moment.
Yeah.
Because it seems like your career path was rather extraordinary to me. I have a copy here, timeline, if you need it.
Right, I can look at it. Yeah.
And I noticed partway through that you also went back for an MBA.
I did, actually. I was working at a public relations agency, and I was at a point in my life where I felt like I was ready to go back to school. It was 1976, and so I'd been out of school 10 or 11 years, and it was just a point in my life where I thought, I've been interested in MBA for a long time. It was never sort of the right time. I think this is the right time. And so I applied to all the Chicago schools to their night programs because I was working during the day, and ended up, I think I got accepted at all of them, ended up at deciding on Northwestern, and did my first quarter at Northwestern while I was still working for this PR agency. The tuition was very expensive, and most of the people in the night program were working in jobs where their employers paid their tuition, and mine was not in a position to do that. And my father had said that he would help me with the tuition, but then he was remarried and she wasn't so crazy about me spending the money on tuition, so I decided to look for a job that paid tuition. And so I ended up seeing a job at the Quaker Oats company that looked like a really interesting job, but also they paid 100% tuition for graduate school. And the fact that I was working on the MBA at night was actually one of the reasons they hired me, because they thought it would help me in my job there. So I did, so pretty much the whole time I was working at Quaker, I was going to school at night working on my MBA. And so it took me 4 years, I think, to get the degree.
And you were manager of a divisional manager?
At Quaker Oats, I was manager of divisional public relations. So what that meant really was I was in charge of working with the different divisions, like the food division and the pet food division and the chemicals division and their other divisions, on public relations programs for their divisions.
Okay. And after Quaker Oats, do you want to trace your career path?
Yeah, because actually, I mean, it was sort of interesting. While I was at Quaker Oats, I was very involved with their pet food division, and the president of Quaker's pet food division was also the chairman of the trade association, the Pet Food Institute, and the Pet Food Institute was thinking about doing a public relations program to find a way to sell more pet food, and he asked me to chair the Pet Food Institute's Public Relations Committee as we looked at doing this program. And so I did, and we ended up hiring an agency called Golan Harris. And so the people at Golan Harris asked me if I would think about coming to work for them. And actually, it's sort of an interesting story because we were in San Diego at a conference, a pet food industry conference. And so the two, Dale Golan and Tom Harris, the Golan and the Harris, I was with both of them. And so they said to me, I said I was going to Las Vegas from San Diego. And they said, oh, what are you going to do there? I said, I'm going to get married. So sure enough, I went there and got married. And then both of them came to me and said, would you think about coming to work for us? So I made the decision to leave Quaker Oats. I had my degree. It was all paid for. They paid for all of it. And, lucky for me, they didn't, like some of the schools that pay for degrees, you have to stay a certain period of time or whatever. Quaker was very generous about it. And so I left Quaker and went to work at Golan Harris. And I was there for 8 years, I think. And it was really a great experience for me. And so for the first few years, I ran this pet food account. Mm-hmm. So I went from being the client to being the agency person running the account. And then from there, I was promoted several times. And it was a exceptionally good experience for me. They both Al and Tom were wonderful people. Tom was a great mentor to me. And so he decided to retire, and so I thought once he was gone, I thought, I think it's time for me to move on as well. So, I started looking for a job. I ended up, I'm not sure if it's on the resume or not, because it was a very short, 1 year, very bad job. Oh yeah, it's here. So, looked at different options, and the one that I decided on was with a firm called Lesnick Public Relations. So I went to work there for a year. It was not a good experience, and so while I was there, I started looking for other opportunities, and this PR firm called Manning, Selvage & Lee was looking for somebody to run their Chicago office. So I did several interviews with them and got hired, and so that was sort of my last formal job. I was there for 11 years as the managing director of the Chicago office. So, PR is and was a field where there were a lot of women, and, I think women's skills matched up well with, generalization-wise, with sort of the requirements of the job. But, so there were other women who were heads of offices the same time I was, so that was probably the first time in my career where I was with, like, women peers. So anyway, it was a great experience, and and then things changed, like they always do, and so it was right after 9/11, the economy got bad, and the travel got really hard. I used to go to Cincinnati a lot. My biggest client was Procter & Gamble, and so I used to go every week or two there on the 6 a.m. flight, and it used to be you could just, like, jump out of bed and jump in the car and jump on the plane. But now, after 9/11, the travel became a lot different, and, it was just like a time that a lot of change was happening, and a lot of the people that I worked with were making decisions to go somewhere else. So Peter and I had bought a house in Palm Desert, California, like a year before that, and so we were there just like in November for 3-4 days, And I'm looking out the window thinking, this is really pretty here, and this is really nice. And then I had some, not pleasant calls and conference calls and clients, and I thought, I think I'm done. So I came home and announced my retirement, and that was it. Worked for 2 more months, and then moved on.
Do you still have a little foot in the game?
I do. I still do some consulting.
Mm-hmm.
I just finished a project that I was doing, so I still do some. And then I do a lot of the things I do use the same skills, but nobody pays me for them. So
it's a great work, volunteer work.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah.
Let's go back in time to 1970s.
Okay.
And when you first were inducted into causes
right.
and activism, can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I was working at Connor's Publishing Company, and there were I had a lot of female peers, and it was all of a sudden stuff started being in the newspapers and in the media about this women's lib, and we started talking about it, and then somebody found out that one of the guys who had the same title we did was making twice what we were making, and we're like, oh my God, and he wasn't very smart. We thought, we're smarter than he is, we're better than he is. How could he be making twice what we're making? So we were pretty appalled, and so we started, lots of whispering and talking. Then we started getting together outside of work and doing consciousness raising, where we would talk about all this stuff that we never had really thought that much about or talked that much about. And so then started to be announcements in the media that Betty Friedan, who was the national president of NOW, had announced, apparently to the surprise I've since found out of the NOW board at the time, that we were going on strike. And so there was going to be this big rally in the Civic Center, and the slogan was, don't iron while the strike is hot, which is cute. And so, women were supposed to go on strike and come to this rally, and so we all said, yeah, we're going to do that. So I went to my boss, who was a very nice guy, and I said, what, I'm not going to be at work on Wednesday or whatever day it was, and I'm going to go on strike for the day. Is that okay? And he said, oh, yeah, that was okay. I got permission to go on strike. So we went down to the Civic Center, a group of us, and it was unbelievable. There were thousands of women there and these fabulous speakers, and it was so inspiring and it was so incredible. And so there was a NOW meeting, I think, the next week, and so like, yeah, we have to do that. We signed up when we joined, and so it really was a galvanizing time, but particularly a galvanizing moment to just realize, that a lot of what you hadn't understood to be sexism was.
So the National Organization for Women, that was your first meeting of them? It
was my first meeting. It was the Chicago chapter, and I got active and I got involved really quickly. So I joined the Public Relations Committee, and and actually the woman who ran the committee at the time was a very skilled public relations professional, and so I learned so much about public relations. It's really where I learned how to do public relations was from her. So, I owe a lot of my career to my radical activities. So got involved in that, and then she moved to New York, and so then I ended up heading the committee and running the committee, the Public Relations Committee, and then being involved in, I was very surprised at how much I liked the confrontation and the activism. I had never really been confrontational. I'm not a really confrontational person, but I really kind of liked it. I was surprised at that. We did a lot of, marching into the executives club because they wouldn't let women be members, and we just barged in, and we did a lot of things like that, and so it was pretty heady time. It was pretty exciting. We did lots of speaking engagements, and it was a time when there was a big debate about women's lib and if it was a good thing or not, and there was a lot of, people making fun of it, and my sister has 3 daughters, and I remember, and I give them such a hard time about it to this day, because they would argue with me, like, but don't you want men to open the car door for you? And they've all ended up being very feminist, and the youngest actually is a professor of women's history, and, so, she's sort of the most radical of the 3, but, it's just, it was such a strange time, but it was really fascinating, and, we would, one of Now's sources of revenue was to book speakers, and organizations would pay to have a speaker come, and, a lot of it was like Kiwanis groups who wanted to just sort of heckle you, and then a lot of debates. Phyllis Schlafly, do you know who Phyllis Schlafly is? And so,
if you want to explain just again to the people.
Yeah, Phyllis Schlafly was this woman lawyer from Alton, Illinois, who was the head of the Eagle Forum, is what she called it. And she's, I understand her today as like an extreme right-winger, but she was very anti-women's lib, if you will. And so her, she would argue and debate people all the time, and she was a lawyer, so she wasn't exactly sitting home baking cookies, but she thought all other women should be, and she was a very formidable debater, and so I ended up actually debating her twice, once on TV and once before a live audience at a college, and it's pretty terrifying, but also very fulfilling and rewarding, to think that you could sort of hold your own. And the second time I debated her, as we walked off, she said to me, "You're a formidable opponent." And I thought, I shouldn't be flattered by something she says, but I am, So, it was a scary time. Not that you thought anyone was going to hurt you, but it was doing things, at least for me, that I'd never done before, never thought about doing, actually really enjoyed doing, and realized about myself that I always like to do the hard stuff, still to this day. So it, and I think it comes back from being younger than everybody in school. I mean, I do think, that in a weird way I sort of owe that to my parents putting me in this bad position, because I'm always trying to still, prove myself. And I mean, my leisure activities now are golf and bridge, which are like the 2 hardest things in the world. And I know I do them because they're so hard. So I never stop trying to, prove something, whatever it is. So, anyway.
Well, let's continue with now. You were also a regional?
Yeah, so then what happened was the woman who was, I'm trying to remember, why did she not become regional director? Anyway, the woman who was the regional director, the Midwest regional director, the way Now was structured was, at the time, there was a national board, and then the country was divided into 4 regions, and there was a regional director for each region, and their job was to start the chapters in that region and then to work with the chapters in that region if there were issues and whatever. And so Mary Jean, who was the regional director, called me and said, I think she was termed out, whatever, and that there was time for an election of a new regional director. Was I willing to do it? And I said, yeah, okay, fine. And so maybe the first weekend, she's like, oh, you have to go to Minnesota for, there's a big problem between these Now chapters in Minnesota and whatever. I'm like, really? Because I sort of thought this wasn't going to be that big of a deal, this job. And the person who ended up succeeding me laughs that Mary Jean and I both told her, you make a few phone calls, you write a few letters, no big deal. I was lied to, we lied to her. So, I mean, it turned out it was a very big deal. It was a ton of travel, and, we had so little resources at the time. There was no internet, there was no email, so everything was mail that you had to write the letter and mail the letter and copy it, and the companies that I worked for have no idea how generous they were with their photocopy equipment, but it was hard. because the communication was so hard, and we had a budget. I think my budget was like $100 for the year or something like that, and the region went from Michigan to Oklahoma.
Oh,
so
okay.
you know, it was challenging, and there was a fair amount of infighting that went on, you know, as I think there still is in any kind of organization like this, and so, you know, you sort of get caught in the middle of trying to fix that, and so I did that. I did it for 2 terms, and there was the thing that sort of drove me out ultimately, you know, and it now got to a point where there were like 2 factions, and, you know, the Midwest people were sort of one faction, and the East Coast people were another, and whatever. And so it just got to be unpleasant, and I finally thought, you know, why am I killing myself doing this? And there was a woman in Minnesota who was like the thing that killed me through almost the whole time. She wanted to start her own now chapter because she didn't like the existing chapter, and we said no because there's already a chapter there, whatever, and she just was mad because they wouldn't elect her to anything because they didn't like her, and so she decided to start her own chapter. Like, no, you can't do that. So she's like, you are racist. So then she filed a grievance against me. It turned out that she was Hispanic. Nobody knew that, but she said she was. So she filed this grievance against me for being racist, and, you know, it just got to be like, I'm done. So I did, after, I think it was 1974, you know, after my second term ended, and I think I'm done with this for a while. And so I really, you know, I mean, obviously continued to be a feminist, but I didn't really do anything activist until I got involved with VFA like 10 years ago,
So that's about the time you also were pursuing your MBA too, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, a few years after that. Yeah, it was actually about a year or 2 after that. It was 74, I think, that I finished my term, and I started graduate school in 76. So it was a time in my life where, you know, I didn't have like a lot of big stuff going on, and so it was a good time to go back to school. So, yeah.
And
Sam, stop that.
Taking advantage of you.
Come on, stop that.
That's quite all right. So then came this organization that just totally intrigues me, the Veteran Feminists of America. Tell me about that, how it was, the goals when it was started. And
you know, it started 20 or 21 years ago by Jackie Ceballos, a woman. She was the Eastern Regional Director when I was the Midwest Regional Director. And I think she decided, gee, wouldn't it be fun to have like a reunion and get together with, you know, people that we used to do stuff with. And so she started it sort of very casually, and then it grew from there into an organization that was about really 3 things. One is just reunion. One was recognizing us for what we did. You know, her concept was, and her original name was the VFW, the Veterans of Feminist Wars. You know, because they were wars in a way. And so, and I think her brother had been in the military and got a Marine medals or whatever, and so I think her thought was, well, we should do this for the women who fought all these battles, you know, for women's rights. And so I think the courts didn't think that that was a good name, and so it got changed to Veteran Feminists of America, a name which confuses people because they think it has to do with military veterans, which it doesn't. It just means, you know, veteran in the broader sense. And then a huge goal is to make sure the history isn't forgotten. And, you know, a concern that a lot of us have is 2 concerns, really. One is that younger women sort of think that things were always this way, and they don't know about the battles that were fought and what it took to, you know, get things changed. I mean, I remember the rally that I went to on August 26, 1970, there was a flyer, and it was our demands, the now's demands, and one of them was related to women in medical school, dental school, business school, because it was like 1%, law school, like 1% of the students in all those professional schools were women. And that, I think, for women today is shocking to think of, you know, because most of those classes are at least 50% women today. The want ads in the paper were help wanted male, help wanted female, and you couldn't apply for a job that was a help wanted male job, and of course all the good jobs were the help wanted male, and so that was another demand, is to desegregate the want ads, and stuff that I think sounds like the dark ages when you talk about it today to somebody who's 23 years old or whatever, but it wasn't that many years ago. I think one of the goals is to make sure that people understand that it wasn't always this way, and that it was fought for, and that you have to continue to fight for it. And then, the other is to try to do what we can to make sure those rights don't get eroded, because most of the changes that happened were during more progressive administrations, and when you get more conservative administrations, they do try to pull back stuff. Clearly, like women's reproductive rights is an area where there's been so many negative inroads in terms of infringing on, the rights that women had. So those are the main goals of VFA.
And I noticed I think it was on VFA's site, that you're still hosting events.
We do events.
And that they seem to be on college campuses. So
sometimes they are. We did one 2 years ago in Milwaukee at Alverno College, and it was for a few reasons. One is we hadn't really done anything in Milwaukee, and so we thought it would be a good market. Sister Joelle Reed, who was the president formerly of Alverno, was one of the founders of NOW originally, and some of the Alverno nuns were very activist nuns, involved in NOW in the early days. And so Mary Jean Collins and Marianne Lupa, who are both people that I was in NOW with in Chicago and are both on the VFA board, they're both alumni of Alverno, and felt like that's where they got all of their feminist leanings and information. And so we thought, let's go back and honor Alverno, because of the stuff it did for women back in the 60s, when I think a lot of parents thought they were sending their daughters to a Catholic women's college. It was going to be very calm, and it wasn't at all what I think they expected. But it really did break all kinds of walls down for women. They do a weekend college, and things that are really good for the community. So we did this event 2 years ago at Alverno, and it was really trying to tie in with a younger generation, and so we tried to get as many students there as we could, again, to just awaken them to how it used to be and how things have changed. And and then they're very activist young feminists today in a different way, and so we had some of them on our panels as well to talk about some of the things that they were doing. So,
and what kinds of things are they doing?
Well, one of the speakers, actually what I thought was the most interesting, it was the thing that I was in charge of, was 40 years ago, the women writers at Newsweek filed a lawsuit against Newsweek because the women could only be researchers and the men could be writers and whatever. And so they filed this big lawsuit. And then 2 years ago, there were all these young women writers at Newsweek who didn't know anything about what had happened at Newsweek 40 years earlier. And they started talking to each other about how come the men get all the cover stories and how come they get all the opportunities, and there's something going on here. And each of them thought it was just them, and then they started talking to each other and realized it was a pattern. And then somehow one of them found out about what had happened at Newsweek 40 years earlier, and sort of at the same time, one of the women from 40 years earlier had just written a book about it. And so they got together, the 40-year-ago women and the current women, and talked about how much hadn't changed And so we had a panel of like one of the younger ones who was an activist and the one who wrote the book, talking about similarities and differences, 40 years, and what the 40 years ago the women filed a lawsuit. What the 40 years later the current women did is they went to their management and talked about it and wrote a cover story for the magazine about what they thought was going on at Newsweek, and so it was just like a different way of dealing with it. It's just that was one example, but it was pretty interesting.
It must have been well received by the students.
Yeah. Oh yeah, very much so. Yeah.
Do you see yourselves the role of VFA kind of evolving a bit, so it might become or is becoming almost like a mentoring of others, of younger women?
I don't know if we've thought of it about as mentoring so much, but educating certainly.
Okay.
And then there has been actually a part of VFA called the Bridge Project, where younger women have sort of been adopted by older feminists. So there is some of that mentoring that goes on too. So, so the event we just did at the end of September in St. Louis was really interesting because it was history that a lot of us didn't know about, actually. So, Second World War, the men are off fighting, the women are in the factories, Rosie the Riveter, doing these men's jobs, whatever. The war ends, the men come home, and sort of as we've heard it, the women go home and happily are housewives and dusting and whatever. So, but a lot of the women didn't want to go home and wanted to stay in the jobs that they were in, but they weren't allowed to stay in those jobs because the men got the jobs. And so then what happened was the unions pushed for all of this protective legislation so that the women couldn't work long hours, they couldn't do heavy lifting, they couldn't do this and that. But what it was really about was keeping the women out of the good-paying jobs so that the men could have the good-paying jobs. So there's a whole bunch of women who are really feminist activists starting in 1945, and several of them were founders of NOW in 1963. So, but they'd been fighting this fight for, 20 years, 18 years, whatever. And so, the sort of history of NOW as we had heard about it was, these sort of upper middle class, educated women from Ivy League schools and whatever. There was this whole group of labor women, who were part of it, and then NOW was pushing for the Equal Rights Amendment. The unions were against it because it would mean they couldn't have the protective legislation. And so this big battle ensues where the labor women end up sort of walking out of NOW over the ERA, and then eventually the unions change their position and they get back together. So we just did this event called Labor in the Women's Movement, The Untold Story and Why It Matters. And, was people telling the stories of these union women who, were really brave and made these huge changes, within their unions, within their companies, and then got involved in the women's movement. So it was really fascinating. One of the ways we sort of tied it together was the Supreme Court on the last day of its session in the spring issued two rulings: the Hobby Lobby decision, which was limiting, it said that Hobby Lobby and certain other corporations didn't have to provide certain forms of birth control to women. And at the same time, it was another anti-union decision, so they issued both of them on the same day. So again, here's women's movement and the labor movement fighting a more right-wing agenda, and the irony of both of those on the same day. Both groups are losing rights that they've had for a long time. So we sort of tied it together that way. So it was a great conference, though. It was really, really good.
And do you have others planned in the future? Or?
Yeah, we're not sure what it's going to be next. We might do something in Chicago on the labor aspect. Some of us would really like to do that. We did one in Chicago in 2004. We did an event tying in with UIC with their women's programs. But there's this really great labor education council in Chicago where a lot of the universities, human resource and labor people are involved in it along with the unions, and that could be really nice to tie in with them. So one of our speakers, one of our closing speakers was from University of Illinois at Urbana, but she's in Chicago because that's where their labor stuff is. So she was one of our closing speakers, and she was great. So yeah, it's really so. Or we might do something in Washington, so we're sort of going to figure that out. So I'm in the events committee, so we get to decide that. So,
excellent.
Yeah.
So you had mentioned earlier on too, when we were talking about your career, and you mentioned how your career kind of informed your activism, but at the same time you're the person in public relations, right, when you started with now, really mentored you, taught you a lot. So how did with the two of your career and your activism, can you see like a parallel path? Did they continue to influence each other?
Yeah, you know what, I mean, I stayed sort of out of women's movement activism for most of the time of my career, you know, after I left being the regional director. But the skills that I learned really, really, really helped me, and it made me not afraid. It made me speak out for myself and for other people, and you know, so yeah, it really helped me a lot. And you know, there were times in my career where, you know, there were things that happened that I didn't necessarily think were morally the right thing or whatever. You know, the agency that I worked for originally had represented the Illinois Right to Life Committee, and you know, so we sort of had some debates about things like that. But you know, generally not really significant conflicts. I mean, I did have experiences with male clients from time to time, you know, where I felt they put me in a uncomfortable situation. But you know, I think the experience in the women's movement made me not feel like I had to do something I didn't think was the right thing to do, and it made me not afraid to say no and to tell my managers or whatever. You know, I had a client once who was such a pig. So we had a meeting in Washington, and he called me and he said, you know, oh, you know, are you gonna stay after the meeting? Maybe we could have dinner. I'm like, no, I'm going back right away. Oh, okay. Then he called me back. Well, then you must be coming in the night before. I'm like, yeah, I am. Oh, well, why don't we have a drink? So, you know, I was very clever. I thought I arranged for a friend to, so I was going to meet him at 6 or whatever for a drink. I arranged for a friend to come and meet me at 7. So I get to his hotel, I call him. He's like, well, why don't you come up to my room? I'm like, no, meet me downstairs, you know. And so meet him downstairs, have a drink with him. My friend shows up an hour later, you know, I think I'm fine, I'm protected, and he was mad. So the next day we're in this meeting, and it's like 20 people in a meeting. He turns to me like an hour into the meeting, and he says to me in front of 20 people, you know, you don't really need to be here anymore. Why don't you leave? So I left, you know, so get back to work, and he calls my boss and says, and I told my boss what happened. He calls my boss. He says, you know, we don't want her working on our account anymore. She's not aggressive enough. And I said, you know, the problem is not my aggressiveness. The problem is his aggressiveness. You know, I told him the whole thing that happened. And, you know, I mean, but, you know, I thought, you know, as a matter of principle, do I insist on working on the account? No. You know, the man is always going to be angry with me unless I sleep with them, and I'm not going to do that. And, you know, so, I think I learned, like, handling stuff. And, you know, and I had a really supportive boss who understood what the situation was, and, you know, I thought it would have been nice if they resigned the account because of it, but they weren't going to do that, and I get business you know, so, so stuff like that. So, you know.
Yeah. And then, kind of backtracking again, you met Peter?
You know, Peter and I met through some mutual friends in 1968. And I was dating somebody, he was dating somebody, and so, you know, we just sort of hung with the same group of people for a long time. And then, you know, ended up, I had to go to some party that I forgot, somebody wanted me to do something, and so I asked him if he wanted to come with me, and he did. And so we started dating. Let me see, when did we start dating? It was a long time, 1975, I think, and then we got married in 1982. So it was a long courtship. So,
now, does he support you in your different activities now?
Yeah, he does. I mean, he has no personal interest in it. You know, the last thing he would want to do is like come to any of my VFA conferences or whatever. But you know, he's pretty good at being a feminist, and and you know, he has things that he's interested in that I'm not, and I have things, you know, that I do that, you know, and so he's, you know, he never says don't do this or, you know, whatever. So no, he's good. Yeah.
Now, thinking back to your father and politics, have politics also, I believe, pursued you throughout your life too, or attracted you, or?
You know, there were times that I was interested politically, and then times, you know, where it sort of wasn't that significant to me. You know, when I was in college, you know, it was when Kennedy was except still in high school when Kennedy was elected. I was in college when he was killed. You know, and so that was a time where I think a lot of young people were really like inspired by him and by thinking we could change the world. And then I didn't really get much involved. Then in the 70s, my sister was married to a man who was very involved in politics and was a state representative, and so, you know, we got involved. I worked with her and with him, and so I got involved politically then. And then, you know, probably it wasn't until like 2007 where I got really back into it, when Obama was running. So, you know, at that point I got pretty hooked on it, and so, you know, spent a lot of time working during the primaries and then during the general election. And my sister and a couple of friends and I went up to Wisconsin every weekend in 2008, you know, trying to knock on doors of people who weren't that excited about having him as their president. But we had a lot of fun experiences. So, yeah, so since then I'm probably too hooked on it. I wish I weren't.
Are you? Your public relations skills, or just volunteering in general?
You know, most of it's just sort of general volunteering. You know, it's just I was working on this campaign of this election. There just was for both, primarily for the congressman in this district who did not get reelected, and then also for the governor. And you know, so I sort of did whatever they needed me to do, and I was working, among other things, in the 10th Congressional District Democrats office, and the woman who runs it is a great delegator, and so, you know, I sort of like do whatever she asked me to do. So one day she's like, could you vacuum the office? I was like, sure, you know, whatever. So they asked me to write an article for their newsletter about my volunteer experience, like the day after the election. I'm like, I don't really think I can do that, you know. But anyway, so I met with them and talked about it, and I did write an article that, you know, fun, like trying to still be optimistic, you know, because, I mean, the one point they made, and it's true, is, you know, yes, we lost, but at least I know I tried to help, and think how bad I would feel if I hadn't done anything. And, you know, she said they're getting all these calls from people saying, oh, I feel so guilty, I didn't do anything, I should have done something. So, you know, at least if you tried and you know, did something. So, you know, so I did write an article, so.
That's something. You never know how that's going to inspire somebody.
Right, yeah, exactly. And it, you know, and it was about, you know, volunteering and fighting, and so.
I want to step back a little bit again to your career, and I believe I read something you were involved in professional association, Women in Communication.
I wasn't real, I mean, I was a member of it, you know, but involved with the Chicago chapter. I didn't have any leadership position in it. But what I did do when I was in Now Women Employed was just being created, and so I was the first chairperson of Women Employed when it was formed, you know, and sort of did that job until it got on its feet. So one of the things that we did as Women Employed was we did a sort of a debate with the CACI, the Chicago Association of Commerce and Industry, which is like the Chamber of Commerce, and the guy who was the head of it was the chairman of Carson's, and named Virgil something, I forget his last name. And so he and I sort of had this debate in front of this whole live audience, and that was a little bit scary, but that was kind of fun. So.
Are you still involved with them at all?
No.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think they've done a great job.
Yeah, I noticed they have some leadership activities for students in the summer. And
oh, did
it?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's a really good organization, and the woman who runs it, Ann Ladke, was involved with us in Chicago Now and was one of the presidents of Chicago Now. So.
Were there other areas in that you were active in that somehow I missed?
What else? I don't know. Nothing that I'm thinking of. You know, the time I was in Now, it was sort of all-absorbing. So, you know what I mean? You know, sort of on the other side of the world kind of a thing. We have this house in Palm Desert, California, and we live in this gated community, and there's a country club as part of it. So I spent 6 years on the board of the country club and doing all their marketing and communication and all that. So, you know, that's one of those unpaid volunteer jobs that, you know.
As soon as they know you have the talent.
Yeah,
and the time.
And the willingness, unfortunately, yeah.
So we've touched on this throughout, but your self-identity, has it changed, or how your activism has changed it? You talked about it giving you more confidence. Other areas or other ways that you feel it has changed you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's changed me, you know, enormously. I mean, you know, with willingness to, like, sort of speak my mind and ask for things and, you know, feel confidence in my own ability. But also I think it created, like, a huge empathy in me, you know, that started probably in the women's movement, and you know, that makes me really feel empathy for anybody who is struggling or isn't being treated equally, or whatever. And so, so what we haven't talked about that, I guess two things that I think might be relevant. One is, and I had this conversation with my sister and my niece the other day, and they don't necessarily agree, but I do, that my mother died very suddenly in 1970, January of 1970. And, at the time, I never connected my activism with her death. But as I thought about it later, I do think it was connected. Yes, it was a coincidence of timing, and, she was not an activist. But I think she was a much stronger person than I understood that she was when she was alive. And so, I do think that had some bearing on me. And I think I always thought I was so much like my father, but I realized, as I went through life that, she wasn't that interested in being a mother. She wasn't that interested in cooking. She wasn't that interested in cleaning. She wasn't that interested in any of the domestic stuff. I'm like, hey, me too. But I never sort of identified with her that much. And as I thought back on it and realized, if she'd lived, in a sort of different time, she loved working, and my father was very entrepreneurial and he had a lot of different kinds of businesses, and she always worked in his businesses, and she loved doing that, and she really did not like any of the domestic stuff at all, so my father was really the cook in the family, so.
Okay. Is there anything else that we haven't talked about that you would like to include?
One of the things that we haven't talked about, and I'm not even sure what I think about, is being raised Jewish. And, I think I grew up in the South Shore community was, I don't know, roughly half Jewish, half Catholic maybe. And, so I never felt any any discrimination based on religion growing up. But when I went away to college, it was, it was a different kind of a situation. And, sort of the first time, that I'd been in an environment where, I was one of like a small number of Jews in my dorm, for example. And, I was born right at the end of the Second World War, and I've become extremely interested in the Holocaust. And it wasn't anything that my parents ever talked about growing up. I didn't know anything about it. And I've since asked, the friends that I grew up with, and none of them knew anything about it either. And I think because it was so close, people just didn't talk about it. Now they teach it in schools and whatever, but it wasn't anything that we were ever taught in school. And you would sort of think that a Jewish kid growing up, starting in the 40s, that it would be something that shaped their life or informed their life. And, and I've read a lot about children of Holocaust survivors, and for them it's a whole different situation. But it's just sort of fascinates me that it wasn't anything that anyone talked about. And then, I got interested in genealogy, sort of unfortunately a little late because everybody was dead. And I realized, I have no idea if I had any relatives who stayed in Europe and were killed during the Holocaust. And, so I think I've sort of, again, just going back to the whole empathy thing, I think it sort of came later to me, that the religious piece of it, from just having, now read so much about it and learned so much about it. So.
Is it kind of the spiritual or is more the history?
Yeah.
Do you know when your grandparents came over? Or
yeah,
they
came over in the late 1800s. So, they were here. They weren't in Europe during the war, but I got involved in this, in a genealogical, in this research, and I found people that I'm sure are related to me, and, yes, there were relatives, they had relatives, so I don't know how they're related to me exactly, but I know they are, and so I know, I thought, gee, could my father have not had any cousins? Could his parents have been only children? I don't think that's very likely from then, but so whether, one of these cousins that I found is like, what, they probably all hated each other and they left to go their separate ways, and now you're trying to bring everybody back together, so which is one of the things that I've done is, tracked down a lot of relatives and done a bunch of reunions, found relatives and brought them together, and which it's been pretty interesting. So,
have you looked at any kind of international women's organizations? Have you any interest?
It's not something I've ever been involved with. I have actually like a good friend from now who has, her husband worked for Procter & Gamble, and so they lived in Asia, and they lived in a lot of places, and, and so she's had all this opportunity to do all this international stuff. I just haven't at all, so.
So the international is all really more exploring history.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting. That should be a really interesting project for you. That's.
Yeah, it's not something I've done, much. When I first retired, I spent a ton of time on it, and then you just keep hitting these brick walls. And I went to several genealogical conventions and, classes and whatever. So, Jewish genealogy is very difficult because so many of the records were destroyed during the war, and so, sort of hard. And Jews didn't have last names until like the late 1800s, so it's very hard to try to track people down. So, one of the, I think last year I was at a small convention, and this guy was speaking about surnames, and he was saying that, like, in a lot of places in Europe, you were required to take a surname, and so, they would take, like, the name of a fruit, for example, and so then, like, on, say, apple, so then on the front of their house was an apple, and then if they moved to the pear house, they changed their name to pear. So he was like, surnames are like not the way to search because, and a lot of the Jewish surnames are like the grandfather's first name, like Jacobson is son of Jacob, and, so it's hard to, it's challenging. So,
very interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. Yeah.
Did, so you weren't, when you left college, by then you were more aware of differences between feeling just like one of the other people, or just anybody in the South Shore, but maybe religion being a different factor when you're in college. When you were working and getting involved in the feminist movement, did that have any impact on you at all, religion at all?
Not really. I guess I was so unaware of religious discrimination, and when I started working at Quaker Oats, it was a very Protestant company. It was, started by the Stewart family and their very waspy family, and there was a guy that I worked with who was Catholic, and he said he was the first Catholic they ever hired. I'm like, seriously? So, I was sort of aware of it, and I'm not at all religious, but when I worked at Quaker, I took time off for the religious holidays just because I thought I should, sort of to make them more aware of things, even though I didn't really do anything religious during those days. I just thought I should, make them understand that they needed to give people religious, other people who weren't Protestant, certain holidays off or whatever. So,
So that same kind of pattern of trying to educate.
Right, yeah, exactly, yeah.
Kind of
Yeah, create
found a different way of making that
consciousness
education.
raising. Yeah, yeah, exactly, it is, yeah.
Uh-huh. Well, is there anything else, or?
What else? Let me see. What else did we not talk about?
Yeah.
I was trying to find, I found this thing, it was very, VFA did this project a couple of years ago with, oh dear, I would have been looking all over for this, and it should not be clicked onto here. That's not good. It was with Rollins College in Florida, and the idea of it was like a oral history, it was an oral history thing. And so the student, you know, interviewed you in advance, and then at this actual event, then, you know, you and the student on stage would sort of do this conversation. And so the student interviewed me, and I have the transcript, but then she never showed up at the event.
No.
No. But do you have any interest in having this transcript?
Sure.
I mean, I'll make you a copy of it. I mean, it's really a, you know, it's got all the ums and the laps and all that, because, you know, it was just like she just transcribed it. But I'm just looking to see if there's anything there that is of interest. It's all the now stuff, how I got involved. Oh, I did talk a little about my mother's death there. The dime, who was making more money, Marion Luther, the flyer, yeah, Phyllis Schlafly Is, so, I don't know, there's probably nothing we didn't talk about, but I'm going to just make you a copy of it anyway.
Sure, wonderful.
So.
Why don't we do it when we stop the tape?
Okay, yeah, good idea, I'm sorry. I forgot about the tape, which is a good thing.
Which is a good thing.
Yeah,
that's all I need to say.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I'm just checking to see, did I pretty much cover what the questions that the Chicago Area Women's History Council wanted? And I think we covered everything either directly or maybe not quite as directly. And so I just want to thank you very much for taking all this time.
Well, I really enjoyed it. I'm trying to think. I can't think of anything else. I'm sorry.
No, there's absolutely no problem. I think we've covered a lot.
I do too.
And you certainly piqued my interest.
Oh, good.
Thank
good.
you
Well,
so
I'm
much.
so glad that we did this. This was really fun for me.
Fun.